Hello and welcome to Exit Pursued by Podcast, the theatre history podcast where we discuss all the minutiae of the theatre world, from ancient rituals to comic book musicals and everything in between. I'm your host, Evey Wylde, and today I'll be talking to Tom...
Jancis, Evey.
Jancis. Tom Jancis.
If this is going in, folks, I have previously discussed that the fact that my name could be Jancis, Jancis, Janus, just like, it is very funny actually when I go to the theatre and I end up being like, it's Thomas Jancis, Jancis, and I make a little song of it. So going up and they're like, oh, thanks for singing. I was like, well, we start the theatrics when we walk into the theatre, if not before.
Yeah.
But if this has gone into the podcast, hello everyone, you can call me Tom. And that's why we will focus on the first name to avoid stumbling over the last name.
Excellent. I will use this going forward.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Evey.
Thank you for coming on. So, Tom, who are you and why are you here and what are we talking about today?
So, I'm Tom. I am a writer and performer. I work quite a lot in immersive theatre. At the time of recording, my most recent play was Tamman Shud, which was about the unsolved murder mystery in Australia, where a body was found 1948 on a beach, seemingly murdered. And a lot of what I was doing in the play was like going, hey, is this police incompetence or people just not really caring? And rather like another production about mysterious bodies, Operation Mincemeat, a lot of going, people who are only special because of their terrible ending, but like, no, it's the humanity of it. So yes, I also play role-playing games, which is how I met Evey. We are part of a company called Roll Together, in which the two of us always get on incredibly well in characters. Our characters always love each other. No, it's a really fun dynamic. So, I'm very excited to be here, and the topic for today, we're talking about theatrical ghosts.
Very spooky.
First out of the gate for like a spooky killing episode. Ooh.
It makes me wish I was releasing this at Halloween now. That might have been more fitting.
I like to think you're releasing it in like June, so everyone's like, wow, what a heat wave, and you're like, nah, let's talk about some murders.
Okay, so the first question is an obligatory question. You may roll your eyes, but I feel like it needs to be asked. Do you believe in ghosts?
Big question. So this is the interesting thing where I'm sort of like, I'm very open to a lot of things when it especially comes to that. Like, folks, you're getting to learn a bit of my backstory here. So, Evey, you know the episode of Only Fools and Horses with the Chandelier?
I'm going to say yes and look it up later.
Look it up. Anyway, I grew up in that house. That house is a girls' boarding house in Dorset, and my mother was the house mistress, so I grew up in a Victorian manor house. Now, that house was owned by the Ismay family. James Ismay lived there, and his brother, Bruce Ismay. Now, Bruce Ismay, you might know from the hit film Titanic, as working for the White Star Company. So, Bruce Ismay was on the Titanic when it went down. And these are the stories that I've been told, which is weird because you've been told ghost stories about your own house, and you're like, wow, okay. So, supposedly, James was supposed to be on the Titanic. And then I think he got pneumonia and was in bed. And supposedly, James woke up at the moment the Titanic was going down and went, Bruce is in trouble. And everyone went, oh, wow, James, you're crazy. And then it was like, no, actually. The other bit of the story is that Bruce was getting off the Titanic and there was a nun, which, again, when you're starting ghost stories, ghost nun, who was like, oh, please let me into the boat. And Bruce was like, no, you're not getting on. And then the nun died. And they were like, and that's why the house is haunted by a nun. And also similarly, like, I went to the school where the house was, and then people would be like, oh yeah, you know how there's the ghost of those twins that haunt the Bower Stairs? And I was like, I haven't seen these ghosts. That doesn't seem fair. I live there. And then all of a sudden, supposedly I caused a ghost.
You caused a ghost?
Supposedly I murdered my twin, which was weird because I didn't know I had a twin, but supposedly I drowned my twin and now he haunted the stairs, which is quite fun to suddenly...
Sorry, how did this story get
I don't know. I don't know. It's one of those things that suddenly someone starts going, oh, I've heard about the ghost. And I was like, oh yeah, the nun ghost. It's like, no, the twin you killed. And I was like, and again, I'm like, 9, and I think that's the one thing, I'm on the cusp of, like, let's say fully becoming myself, and then I had the moment of going, did I kill my twin? I'm sure someone would have mentioned if I had a twin, let alone that I drowned them in the lake.
I thought it was going to go into the realm of in utero had consumed your twin in the room and then they were haunting, but no, that's darker.
Yeah, I mean, it is that sort of like the thing of going, I don't not believe in ghosts, but I'm sort of open to a lot of stuff. And again, when we're getting onto like the theatricality of ghosts, then you get onto people like Houdini. And the wonderful thing of like, I'm sure we'll get onto Houdini, the wonderful thing of him just constantly gate crashing like seances in disguise, you know, and then being like, aha, 'tis I, Houdini. And they're like, ah.
Why did Houdini do this?
See, that was the thing. Houdini, he was like, I am a great magician, but I know it's all tricks. And he had a real thing against, like, charlatans. He would even dress up like women and then be like, oh, you know, my name's Mildred, and, oh, I think my husband Bob. And then he'd suddenly go, there was no Bob, 'twas Houdini. And everyone's like, ah. But this is a lovely thing. Arthur Conan Doyle, who listeners probably know, wrote Sherlock Holmes, you know. Sherlock Holmes, one of the great analytical minds. Arthur Conan Doyle was a spiritualist and really believed in ghosts, to the extent that he was like, Harry, you have a great power with ghosts. And Houdini, who actually liked Doyle, was like, Arthur, it's a trick. And he's like, you would say that. And it all fell apart because Doyle's wife was a medium. And he was like, oh, Harry, you've got to come to one of the seances. And Houdini was like, Arthur, I can't. This is going to be really embarrassing for us. And what she did, she was like, you know, I'm getting a message. It's from your mother. And she wrote out a letter, Harry, you know, I miss you. Houdini literally flipped the table and screamed because, first of all, she wouldn't have called him Harry. She didn't speak English. And he was like, you are a charlatan. Because that was the thing, that Houdini really loved his mother. And it ruined their friendship because Doyle was like, you apologise to my wife. And he's like, what, apologise to your charlatan of a wife?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, this is 100-year-old gossip, but I'm eating it up.
And, you know, we're still getting it to this day where you're being like, how do they do it? And they're like, because someone talks to people in the crowd and gives people notes. They're like, no, they talk to the other side. What about you? Do you believe in the other side?
So the answer generally is no. I have a very rational view of the world, very atheistic. However, I would like to believe in ghosts, and I like the idea of them. And I feel like believing in them would make the world just a bit more of a magical place. I didn't grow up in a household that was like, oh, you're haunted. It was very much a household of ghosts aren't real. People who believe in them are idiots. I don't think that, to be clear. I think that people who believe in ghosts are way more open to the world being a much more magical and interesting place than I am. But I say I don't believe in them. You put me in a room, a dark room with candles, tell me it's haunted, and that a little girl walks through these corridors at night and she cries blood, and I'll be like, but what if I'm wrong? What if they are here? And I think that's a really interesting thing. That is a very primal instinct that is ingrained in a lot of us, even if we don't want to admit it. It comes back to the fear of the unknown, and also the power of kind of cultural oral storytelling, because these stories are reinforced. Yes, they don't have much scientific evidence, but the amount of people who believe it and keep telling the stories is compelling in and of itself.
And again, we're getting into the idea of like, we can tell something bad happened in this room, and you're like, is that because of ghost, or weirdly, being very scientific, vibes? Just like the vibes of this room off. Which again, I think is hilarious when like you're talking to Americans, you're like someone died in this house, and you're like, welcome to England. Of course someone died in this house, you know?
When I was a small child, I did actually see a ghost, though.
Spill.
Actually, twice. Once was a cat.
Cats have souls. Interesting.
It was weird because my dad also saw it. It was a case of we'd both gotten up at 4 a.m. and I was like 3 years old or something like that. And we'd seen a cat meowing at the door. And we were like, oh my gosh, this random cat? What are we going to do? So we opened it and it disappeared into smoke. Like, we both saw it dissipate, and there was never any explanation. Maybe my dad did have an explanation and he saw it run away, and then he just never had the heart to tell me. But maybe ghost cat?
Have you considered the possibility of ghost cat?
And then the other one was when, again, I was like 6 years old. I was half asleep. So that might be the reason for it. But I just came downstairs trying to get ready for school, and I saw a small boy sitting in a doorway, threshold, something we're going to talk about in a little bit, just kind of getting dressed for school, and he just kind of waved at me with kind of like a very vacant stare, and I waved back, and just went to my mum and just said, Mummy, who's that other boy? And we went back, and my brothers weren't up yet, so it wasn't one of them.
That is always the thing, like with small children, where they say the most out-of-pocket stuff, where it's like, oh yes, my friend, the boy who lives in the walls, and you're like, okay, kid, what do you see?
Yeah.
Again, so like connected to that, of like, kind of like, oh, what do you think when you wake up? That again, the fun of like sleep paralysis demons. I had one actually sort of in the folks can't see where I'm recording. I'm recording in like my spare room where there's a pull-out bed because my parents were staying with me. I woke up and it was like, oh god, there's the guy in the corner. But I was like, okay, if I make too much noise, I'm going to wake up my parents, and I don't want that. And my sleepy brain was like, quick, you know the words to say. And it turns out the words to say to get rid of my sleep paralysis demon was boogity boo, I see you. So I acknowledged this. So I whispered that, and the thing just turned into smoke. And I was like, yeah, I drove you back to where you... It could have been a friendly sleep paralysis demon or a ghost, or it just was like, oh, I didn't realize you were awake. I just like watching you when you're asleep. Okay, sorry.
Are you a secret exorcist?
I might be. I'm awaiting a call from the Vatican any day where they're just like, we need an old priest, a young priest, and also this guy. I'm just like, hey.
What if every time you interact with a ghost, you accidentally exorcise it and get rid of it?
It's like pushing daisies, where I'm just like accidentally like, oh, sorry, I sent you to your eternal rest. I like that idea actually, that where they're just like, oh yeah, we're going to just put Tom into like a haunted house to clear it out.
Okay, we're bringing it back to theatre. Yeah, it is part of the premise of the show. So, ghost stories, hauntings. It's a very compelling storytelling method, and it's something that is very much a part of theatre industry, both within the stories that are told and within theatre spaces. So we're going to talk first about an area that you have experience in, a little ghosty told me, which is the dark tourism, ghost tourism, thanatourism, which is a very fun word, area of it.
Yes. So for a few months, I worked on the ghost bus in London. So I got to wear a little hat.
Oh.
I got to be driven around London with a variety of drunken tourists.
I think there's something to be said there about who is drawn to this kind of tourism and entertainment.
Yes.
It's considered quite thrilling and unserious in a lot of ways, and it really does attract people from all different walks of life. And this might be part of the reason that the thanatourism industry and ghost stories themselves thrive as much as they do.
You know, it's that sort of weird thing. It's like, oh yeah, there's like drunk people here, but there's also like, that's a 6-year-old. Hello, 6-year-old. Let's talk about Jack the Ripper.
Oh no.
Yeah. And of course, that's the weird thing, like reading the script where you're like, oh, because honestly, it's all been written for me. And I was like, okay, I did a little bit of my own research, and I was like, never heard of these stories. But one of the most haunted places in the world is the Tower of London, which makes sense because so many people have been murdered there.
So many.
Yeah.
Some legally.
Some legally, such as Anne Boleyn, who is probably, I think, said one of the most frequent ghosts.
I didn't actually know she was a ghost. I thought she just, was beheaded and that was that.
Anne Boleyn supposedly turns up into 40 different places in England.
Oh, wow.
I would say, well, does she commute? Does she, or was there like certain days where she's in the tower?
A very packed haunting schedule, if I had to guess, probably has something to do with her accessibility, because we all learn about her in junior school history, and she's connected with various London sites that are very popular with tourists, so it's quite easy to imagine her as a ghost just going around her ghostly business.
There's also the Bloody Tower, which is the location where the princes in the tower, the nephews of Richard III, were kept. That's the thing where they're like, their bodies were never found. And they're like, okay, we found some children. We don't think it's them. And you're like, what do you mean you just found some children in the grounds?
Ooh.
Yeah, connected to that, the place where the chapel in the Tower of London supposedly was so full of bodies that when Queen Victoria went to go like admire the chapel, she tripped over the bump in the ground, because the bodies were rising up. And so they finally sort of dug it up. And so they were like, okay, we think we found this, including Lady Jane Grey, who was queen for, I think, 17 days, which is one of the greatest tragedies in a long history. It was like, this poor girl who was like, do you want to be queen? Not really. Well, you are queen. Oh, what do I get to do? Nothing. You're dead. We're going to chop your head off. And she's like, oh, no.
Oh.
Which is actually quite sad when you're, like, looking at, like, the Tower of London, like, oh, these are all our kings and queens. They're like, are we going to include her? They're like, well, no, God doesn't approve of the Lady Jane Grey. You're like, oh. Also, supposedly, there's a ghost of a bear, which connects to your thing about, like, because there was a bear, I think it was a polar bear, actually, that was kept at the tower. So if you go to the Tower of London now, you see, like, a big mesh bear. And now people are like, oh, yeah, there's just a ghost bear. And you're like, oh, ghost bear.
Bears have souls.
Yeah, bears have souls.
Exit pursued by Ghost Bear.
Ghost bear! Perfect for your marketing. There's also, if we're talking in particular about like theatrical ghosts, the Adelphi, which is down Shaftesbury Avenue, which currently I think has Back to the Future. But there was a ghost there, 1897, William Terrace, who was like a big leading actor, supposedly was having an affair with his co-star, and then his like one of the other actors didn't approve of that. Maybe he was in love with her. Love story. Anyway, he stabbed Terrace to death outside. I think outside the stage door, and it's like Terrace like stumbled back upstairs and like fell into the arms of his leading lady, and then his dying words were, "I will return." And supposedly, yes, he has.
Oh, wow.
And so he supposedly haunts the. Again, like doing this, I think, I'm trying to remember which one it is. I think the theatre that currently has the Tina Turner musical in supposedly has a thing where people will be like on stage and then they look up to like the gods and there's just a man standing at the back.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey. And I think that's the one also when they did some renovations, they found bones in the wall and then like with it in a cloak. And they were like, how? How were these?
I think that theatre does an actual ghost tour. I think it might be Haymarket. I'm not sure. It's one of the big ones. And I went on it as a child, and they've got actors to come in as historical characters to kind of introduce you to who these ghosts were within history. And they use it to link back to the theatre history, to the theatrical legacy, which is really an interesting part because ghosts are a way of kind of keeping that history alive. Because theatre's been in England since, I want to say 1300s?
But, yeah.
Probably before. But it's a very long-standing tradition that has gone through a lot of evolutions. And being such an unstable profession, superstition and hauntings and ghosts have kind of been built into it as a very kind of foundational thing. It kind of gives inheritance systems, like who sees the ghost, who becomes the ghost, and kind of links theatrical spaces as spaces of liminality. So what I kind of want to ask you are a variety of questions and opinions about this. So theatre is quite a liminal space. What I want to ask you is who becomes a ghost and why, and who sees them? We've covered royalty, children, and actors, actor managers, animals as well. Yeah. Surprisingly.
I like to think, if you're thinking about like why are so many theatres haunted, it's just the drama of it and the quote unquote extraness that if you are like one of the great performers of the 19th century, of course you're coming back as a ghost. Like, I'm sure David Garrick is just wandering around all these old theatres and being like, what do you mean they're not in ruffs? How are you modernizing this?
What is interesting is that I have read a paper that will be linked in the show notes that suggests that the inclusion of a ghost after your death kind of cements you in a place in theatrical hierarchy and kind of cements your place in renown and within theatre history. And then you have a lot of celebrities and modern theatre greats who see and witness these ghosts. You've got Patrick Stewart, you've got Judi Dench, and that kind of reaffirms their place as one of the greats alongside the ghosts that they see in this kind of inheritance system, which is very interesting to me.
Which, of course, is now making me a little bit sad because we're going to get to the point where it's like, I saw the ghost of Judi Dench, you know.
Oh, no.
Yeah, bless her. Maybe it is that sort of passing the torch, rather. Or where you're just like, oh, yes, I beheld the ghost of Hamlet. You're like, which Hamlet? Oh, you know, Hamlet. It's the funny thing about like, okay, we're not talking about ghosts, but we're talking about vibes. You're like, as you said, the liminal space of the theatre. And you're just being like, you are stuck there in the dark, hearing, to be honest, the voices of people in some cases who've been dead for centuries. And then you're just like, of course. I'm still going back to the idea of like David Garrick being like, what? Yeah. That sounds like the melancholy Dane. I must, just that would actually be quite sweet if you thought about like one of the great like Hamlets who's like, I'm going to go round to every one that's putting on.
Yeah.
I want to see what they're doing with it. And you'd be like, not for me, but I'm sure Cumberbatch had a lovely time doing it.
I love the idea of Garrick just being like the ghostly theatre critic that goes to all of them and then will go to the other ghosts and tell them which ones are worth seeing and just kind of critique the hell out of it. I'd love that idea.
I keep recommending this, it's kind of difficult because I don't think it's ever broadcast in the UK. Have you ever seen Slings and Arrows?
No, I haven't.
Really recommend it. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes. But it's about a Canadian repertory theatre where, like, 15 years ago, like, their great actor who was playing Hamlet had a breakdown on stage and jumped into the grave of Ophelia and refused to get out. And now they've brought him back because his friend, who was his director, has just died. And they were like, we're going to try and redo Hamlet. But the thing is now, that director is now a ghost that only he can see. Ooh. I think they do Macbeth at one point, and he's like, I will play Banquo, of course. And he's like, no, you can't. And everyone's like, oh, he's talking to something. He's sort of saying it. But everyone's like, wow, how do they get the things to move? He's just like shoving things like a cat around the table. Yeah, I think that's because there's so much of like folklore. And again, like if we're looking at like historically, like what is a ghost and like our more sort of modern idea of like we get into the idea of like the genus loci of like the spirit of a location and you're like in this case the genus loci of the theatre might be one of the actors, like you said, like if you're Patrick Stewart and you're like yes, and then again I think as you said it's interesting who gets it and then who gets it, like is the National haunted by Olivier or are there other people who are like actually I've put a lot of work into the building of this place.
Listen, if the National was haunted by Olivier, you could not get Kenneth Branagh out of that building. He would be sat there until he conversed with the ghost of Olivier.
Again, that's heartbreaking, but also really sweet. You're like, oh yeah, Branagh's just here every day. And he's like, Larry? Oh, Larry? Oh God, is it Bradley Cooper who is now with Bernstein? He was like, oh yeah, no, I felt his ghost coming to talk to me. And people were just like, okay, friend.
That's an interesting point, actually. It's not theatre so much as performance. But there has been a few cases of actors going a little bit too method and claiming that the ghost of the person they are portraying has inhabited their body. I'm thinking of Jim Carrey.
Yes. Man on the Moon, yeah.
Yeah, very problematic, but very linked to this performative history of performing pasts and embodying these pasts that we know about.
Even to the extent that in that film, I'm trying to remember which, because there's someone who plays himself who was actually very good friends with Andy Kaufman, who got really upset actually on set, and he was like, Andy turned it off and was actually my friend. And never treated me like this. Again, this is a very separate, like, little diversion. But when you're like, oh, these are the people playing themselves, or a version, like, I know there's Frost Nixon, where there's, like, I think the CIA agent who's, like, a real, like, tough guy and really hard. Supposedly the real guy is absolutely lovely, but was like, oh, no, that's fine. If you need a bad guy, I'm happy. And I think he's been that character, quote unquote, as a real person in multiple things where he's like, oh, I'm happy to be like the bad guy in this. He was like, oh, David Frost, you could never talk to the president. But again, it's the funny thing like with the Globe where they're like, oh, I really feel like the power of Shakespeare here. And you're like, oh, the Globe wasn't there. It's like, it's down there. Again, as I said, like the liminal kind of like conjuring of like the spirits. You're like, oh no, because we keep saying the words here. It's gotten into the wood and it counts.
I think there are multiple layers here because there is the layer of a lot of theatrical tradition is performing plays that were written and produced many hundreds of years ago. So it is bringing those past and hundreds of years of legacy to the stage and embodying that in the modern day. I keep talking about the liminality of the theatrical space and we keep mentioning it, but it's probably worth defining what we mean, which is that the stage is very much a transportative area, an area of transition. There's backstage, stage, and audience as very distinctive areas. And we've got the stage performance space as the area between the two. And it's kind of an area where fiction is put on very literally. And it's very much between the realms of real and unreal because you are experiencing it as real people. And yet it is still fictive. And a lot of ghosts are seen in liminal spaces. I'm talking about like doorways, windows, corridors, areas going from one place to another as kind of ghosts are between life and death. They get seen in these kind of places, which I think makes theatres a really rich place and a very obvious place for them to be seen and to inhabit.
Absolutely. As I said, like the transformative nature of a theatrical space, because again, you're getting into like Peter Brooks going, all you need is an empty space. I know when I was doing my masters, we started getting into like, is it possible to do like theatrics if people aren't aware? And I was like, having done like street theatre and like immersive, yeah, I was like, absolutely. And people were like, well, how do you know? It's like, it doesn't matter. Oh, well, you just do it for yourself. You're like, no, but to bring an energy, inadvertently, almost like a ghost, end up in someone else's story. Like, it's happened to me a couple of times. I've inadvertently heard about myself through other people's tellings. And I'm like, not a me story, but something I read online where someone said, I think she was looking like a squirrel in a tree and then fell out of a tree and like nearly hit someone. And this family were like, oh my goodness. And like 2 years later, she was in like a coffee shop and someone, oh my God, you're the tree girl. You're the one. And then like, I tell everyone, like, I was just walking through the park with my family and then a woman fell out of a tree. As I said, those sort of liminal I was about to say interspecial. I was like, ooh, that's a very different thing. Like intersectional, like the transition from spaces. Also because theatre is in itself a very temporary thing. You know, you build a set, it goes away, it moves on. And then, again, it's like talking a lot about like, I was about to say Vesta and Visage. And I'm talking about a lot of spiritual stuff here. But that idea of like going, oh, this is the space where these things happened, which is then very weird when you go to a theatre and then you'll be like, oh, I saw like a murder here. And now they're doing chitty chitty bang bang. And then, again, if you're talking about like haunted items where you're like, oh yeah, this coat's haunted because, you know, because this thing happened. Not even connected to that. We keep going back to Hamlet. There's multiple people like, oh yeah, I want my skull to be Yorick.
Yeah.
Like, I know David Tennant's like had it and he's just sort of like, I think that guy had been left it to the Royal Shakespeare Company for like nearly 60 years and this finally, and Tennant going, so weird to be looking into the skull of an actual dead guy and being like, oh, oh my.
That's a really interesting case of people willing themselves into these haunted narratives by literally having their skull as a prop and basically remaining on stage even after death, which is so metal and I love it.
Yeah, again, we're taking the more sort of overview idea of ghosts. Like, I've been in plays. I played Bill Sikes, and I looked at it and I was like, it had Wojciech. And I was like, oh, a production of Wojciech, you know, that just sort of thing. This was actually Wojciech. I was like, I don't know when they did Wojciech, but, you know, this was Wojciech's hat. And I was just like, oh, wow. As I said, like, the remains of, like, what has gone before, which is, again, that very funny thing, like, especially with amateur dramatics, you're like, oh, yeah, we just used the same set for, like, the last 30 years, and this is, and you look and you're like, oh, you see that blood? That's where, you know, Cinderella managed to cut herself when she was getting off stage, and that's left as the vestige of, you know, what came before. You know, for theatre being a very temporary thing, but also being like, there is tradition, there is the thing. And it doesn't surprise me if there are spirits be like, okay, I'm drawn to this, or to be able to.
And it's so much a part of theatre culture, even if you don't think about it. It's kind of always there because it's very distinctive to theatre because the same space, the same sets, the same costumes, the same plays, the same actors being recycled and having the metaphorical ghosts of everything that came before. It's very much a memory. Theatre is enacting memory in a lot of ways, but that kind of goes into depictions of ghosts as well. As we were saying with Hamlet, like there is a legacy of someone will play Hamlet and then 30 years later they'll play Hamlet's ghost. And they're kind of on their way out. And we've got The Woman in Black, which was said to be the most scary thing you've ever seen. It wasn't that scary. It was very good. It's had good stagecraft, being as simple as it was. But it really had this buzz about it of being absolutely terrifying because it really played into the spookiness of a theatre.
And The Woman in Black, especially during the Victorian ghost show, again being like, oh, there's a rocking chair and it is moving by itself. And you're just like, oh, yeah, obviously, you know how it's done. But you get into... I saw The Woman in Black when I was at school. Again, I do not know his name, but there was like a guy who was trying to be like all cool and like, tough guy. And he was like, I'm not going to sit in my seat. I'm going to sit on like the stairs. And I think the first time that the ghost screamed, he screamed and fell down the stairs. And the thing is, I don't remember this guy. This is the one thing I remember. In my narrative, do not remember him getting up those stairs again. So as far as I'm concerned, that boy fell down the stairs into the void, into the afterlife, and never returned. But It's also very funny now that I think we mentioned earlier, like where the woman in black was is now Operation Mincemeat. And then just that same sort of idea of like people being like, oh, this is this really haunted, like scary old theatre. And now here's a musical about World War Two.
Yep.
Just, the things you plop on top. But yes, as we said, like the representation of ghosts in like Hamlet. I was thinking about this earlier, because it's always been a thing when people were like, oh, well, maybe he didn't actually, there isn't a ghost, we could do that. And you're like, the start of the play are three unconnected people, including
Yes.
Horatio, going, oh my God, someone needs to tell Hamlet. And I do love it, because Hamlet's like, oh God, I've got all these problems. And then Horatio's like, hey, friend, something you might be interested in. And he's like, oh, Horatio. And also when Hamlet's like, oh, there's more things in heaven and earth than dreamt of your philosophy. He's like, Horatio's like, I know, I saw the ghost. I'm why you're here. I'm the one who brought you. Again, we're talking about that representation of ghosts where, like the Tudors, like ghosts you can't trust. It's not Christian to be a ghost. And so obviously Hamlet can't trust it and needs proof. I think that's the problem now, that again, we all know sort of Hamlet and we're like, we know what's happened. And then they're like, no, it is a surprise that his uncle is a murderer. And you're like, is it now? Yeah.
The evolving attitudes towards ghosts, especially in theatre and fiction, and how it has changed is very interesting. We're saying, oh yes, unchristian to be a ghost, you can't trust him. Whereas today we're like, no, we implicitly trust whatever a ghost says because it's their last message.
Also, sort of like we're talking about other representations, that there's been a joke that Evie and myself have had about there is a production in this country called 222.
It's back now.
Ghost Story. It's back. And this links into what we're saying. It seems everyone and their mums is eventually going to be in 222. There seems to be the wildest selection of, like, we're like, like Tom Felton. You're like, okay, did Harry Potter, that's fine. Or sort of, she was in Doctor Who. And, like, oh, that's good.
Mandy
and then it's
Gale.
like, Mandy Gale, yeah. And then it was like, oh, that's great. And then it's like, Cheryl!
For some reason.
Yeah. We've been joking that eventually both of us will end up in that production at some point. It's like national service. And there's a little bit of me that was like, it would kind of be fun if you knew you had work. And you're just like, I mean, you've seen it, right?
I've seen it. I saw it with Stephanie Beatrice in it.
Again, wild
casting.
choice. Wild casting. Because I was looking, I haven't seen it yet, and I was like, I don't know if I will until eventually I get cast in it. But then people were like, oh, I bet you never know how it ends. And I was like, I think this happens. And then they're like, this happens. So I was like, okay, cool.
If you want to know the ins and outs of it, I have a chapter in my PhD thesis about 222, A Ghost Story, which does spoil the entire thing.
It's actually very, like, if you're taking The Woman in Black, which, again, is written in the style of a traditional Victorian ghost story, but that same sort of idea of, like, Dickens would do A Christmas Carol as a big thing. And, that's a ghost story. To go back to that period of time where, again, we've gone from, like, Hamlet, where it's like, don't trust ghosts, to, like, the Victorian period of, like, going, oh, actually, maybe a ghost will be of help to you. And then 222, where it's like, it's a ghost story. And you're like, okay, the fact that you've titled it a ghost story kind of gives me an idea where this might be going. But like looking at the theatricality of especially Victorian ghosts, where you had like Pepper's Ghost, which is you project onto the pane of glass and it looks like someone's standing there and you're like, oh, amazing. That's how they do a lot of the ghosts at the Haunted Mansion.
Oh, the ride at Disney.
Funny thing with that is that someone, I think in one of the American ones, someone shot the pane of glass and they were like, oh God, because we're going to have to replace this. And they went, kind of looks like a spider web. And so they just painted on the Pepper's Ghost thing. It was like, it's a spider web. Because again, if that had shattered, that was like, we're just going to have to shut that ride for months as we try and replace and redo the trick. What about you, Evie? Think of other famous not theatre ghosts, but ghosts in plays.
Ghosts in plays.
Yeah.
Well, one comes to mind, which is a bit dodgy. A lot of plays with ghosts will do were they a ghost? Were they not a ghost? But the one that comes to mind is an Inspector Calls.
Oh, okay, interesting, yes.
Yeah, it is an interpretation that is encouraged in English classes.
Yes.
I have reread the play quite recently. I've never seen it, but I've reread it and I was very much like, but was he a ghost? Or was he just some randomer off the street that wanted to stir up some shit? I'm not sure.
I like that last idea that he just walks in and goes, I'm an inspector. Mm-hmm. You are bad people.
See my moustache? This is all the proof you need.
I did see it because when I was doing my BA for my sort of final thing where I started talking about like touring theatre. And I went to see a production of Inspector Calls, and I was talking to the cast after, and they said, well, cool. I'm not naming names here, so they're fine. They're like, of course, we hate this play because we do it every year, but we know it's on the syllabus. So that was their kind of advice for me. They're like, if you can find something that's on the syllabus, you know you're going to get the schools in, and then you can just keep touring it. But again, I think it's very funny that Inspector Calls has become like the English thing. You're like, do you get it? Do you get the metaphor? And when like Inspector Gould's like, there is a great storm coming to this country. Like, do you get that? That's World War II. Do you get that? That's coming. And you're like, oh.
I'm trying to think of other ones that do present ghosts on stage. It does tend to be not, this is a ghost, woo, other than Women in Black.
Yes.
Which even so is very much revealed at the last minute of, oh, this wasn't part of the play at all. Woo. Spoilers, but it's not playing anymore.
You might have seen the film with
Daniel Radcliffe.
Radcliffe, yeah.
I know that the musical of Rebecca will be coming to the West End. Ooh. And that's not a ghost, but it is the idea of a ghost with the past haunting the present.
I think you could safely call Rebecca a ghost story because it's just...
Even if it's not literal haunting, it's still got the feeling of it. And it kind of ties back into what we were saying about theatre being haunted by the past, even in just a regular production, with the actors kind of being the ghosts in many ways.
Connected to that, there's a very amusing Mitchell and Webb sketch where they decide to make the prequel to Rebecca. But the thing is, it's still the same plot. And it was like, no, you couldn't possibly put on that dress because the second Mr. Winter is going to wear that dress. And then points to a portrait where like the face hasn't been painted in yet. And it's here's Rebecca being like, oh no, it's terrible. Yes, I think it's very funny that that's become a musical. It's just every... Yeah. I'm trying to think, there's other, again, sort of like not being as versed into musicals, but there's a few where it's been like...
Oh, Next to Normal.
Next to Normal,
It's not a ghost, but it's a hallucination, but it's got the same principle to it, of being between life and death.
Yeah. How dare you? That was a hallucination, and that is a completely different thing. Sort of like... Also sort of like connected to that, where we talk about hallucinations. Like, if you're talking about Macbeth, how do you do the dagger scene?
Yeah.
You know, most of the time I see it, it's just the person acting. I've also seen holograms, and you're just like, no, wrong choice.
No.
We're just like, and literally a dagger floating, rather than like Ralph Fiennes being like, I see it, it's there.
Something I do think that is interesting is that even if it isn't a literal ghost, as we've been saying, the conventions of these ghost stories and ghost appearances are so ingrained into theatre as a vocabulary that it's still kind of used to communicate things that are outside of the realm of normal, that are a little bit other to realism and natural experience. So even if you want to depict someone as being a little bit emotionally unsound, or if they are having hallucinations, you use the language that is also used for ghosts in order as a shorthand to communicate that to an audience, which I think is quite interesting. I think
that's, as you said, that's interesting. Like, we understand things like, hey, ghost, as in the musical Ghost.
Yes.
It's just like, supposedly, again, like, haven't seen that, but again, spoilers for the film and the musical Ghost. The man dies, and then his ghost rises up from his body, and that's the thing. So you get to see the actor die, and then a ghost version of him stand up, and everyone's like, how? There are two. That, again, the trick of people being like, but there are two of them. Again, the trickery of theatre. So, hey, folks, if you're trying to think of another play that involves ghosts, Ghost.
There we go. Technically Beetlejuice.
Oh, gosh, yes.
So it's not been at the West End yet, so I have not been able to see it. But I've seen clips, and I've seen the movie.
He's indeed the ghost with the most. So
he is.
I'm excited to see Beetlejuice. I'm
excited to see how they portray the ghosts as well, with this kind of like offbeat, quirky tone. Because normally it is just spooky or trauma, but this is... It's silliness, and it's fun, as well as being spooky.
I think Beetlejuice is one of those things that does need to come to the UK, because it's like, we get the vibe. Yeah, it is coming.
It is confirmed.
Good.
Or at least that's the rumour anyway.
It is fun to see these things, and then when people were like, hey, do you know Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 is coming? I'm like, cool, immersive musicals, we love them.
Oh yeah.
No ghosts in War and Peace, to its detriment, you know.
There is one piece of ghostly theatre that's on, I think at the moment or starting soon, that I've not seen, that I want to see, but it's a Punch Drunk production.
Oh, yes.
And for listeners who don't know what Punch Drunk is a now international immersive theatre company that does very kind of in-depth promenade productions. And this one production is called Viola's Room, is narrated by Helena Bowen Carter. You have headphones on the whole time, and you walk around and it's a gothic ghost story. So I will be very interested to see how they do that. And they very much focus on venues and bringing out the stories from within very venue-specific contexts.
Again, working in immersive, that Punch Drunk originally sort of did masked things. People were in masks walking around. They closed the Burnt City, which was their retelling of the Siege of Troy, and said, we're not doing that sort of show anymore. But they're interested in like things for family, or as you said, things like this Helen Bonham Carter, where they're like something different. And I think, again, it goes back to, especially like if you're doing something audio, going back to like the very early days of like these are the ghost stories, which I was thinking about, like seeing productions of M.R. James stuff where you never really ever see the ghost. And that's been that's the terror of it being like, again, I think this is great for like the kind of podcast we're doing, where we're like, you always get someone who's like an academic who's like, of course I don't believe in ghosts. How absolutely ridiculous. Oh, look, an ancient relic. Oh my God, there's a shadow in the corner.
Oh yeah, that's me. That's me in this context.
That's what you're going to get into, Evey, where you just be like, oh, cool. You're going to get sent like a haunted book or something. You're like, go poof, pit, pit. Oh my, no. Oh dear. Oh dear. The walls are making noises.
Yes. On that note,
yes,
I think that's a wonderful full circle moment where we bring it back to oral storytelling.
As I threaten you with a ghost.
Yes, as you threaten me with a ghost. I just need to get you around, and then you will exorcise the ghost by your mere presence. So it'll be fine.
Yeah, we'll have a lovely tea party as you're just watching as everything just drifts away. I'm like, it's fine. I'm like oil to these ghosts. They're just like, no. But yes, thank you for having me. It's been lovely talking about the spooky and the various. Hopefully, Branno, you're going to find the Olivier ghost. I believe in you. Yeah,
it'll happen eventually.
Yeah.
Ghosts sometimes take a while to manifest. So if you hang around enough, it's bound to find you. Thank you for listening to this episode on Spookums and Hauntings and Ghosts Within Theatre. Tom, if people want to find you for some reason online, where can they look? Well,
if you do have a problem, if you have a ghost and it don't look good, don't call Ghostbusters, call me. So I am on social media as Thomas Jancis, so THOMASJANCIS. See, it's that little song coming back. I've got a website, I've got the social media. Also, alongside Evey, you can find me doing role-playing games at Roll Together. That's usually Roll Together RPG. We do Mondays, Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Fridays, different games. Also, to be honest, if you go to a theatre in London, I'm probably going to turn up somewhere.
You are the ghost.
I am the ghost. It's actually quite funny because I sent Evey a thing, like an article where they were talking about like, oh, we need to do like safety when it comes to immersive theatre, to make sure the actors are safe. And they have a picture of The Great Gatsby, and everyone's watching it, and I'm in the background dead-eyeing the camera like, I see you and your naughty thing. Yeah, please, I was about to say, come up and talk to me. I'd just be like, be aware that I'm as strange in real life as I am on this podcast. But find me on Tinterwebs. Again, advantage, I've got a unique name. So if you find someone who sounds like me, it's me.
Okay, and you can follow this podcast on the platform formerly known as Twitter at EPB_pod. If you have any comments or would like to join the discussion, please do tweet us on there or send us a message. And all information sources and references, as well as potentially further reading, will be linked in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We upload every other Sunday afternoon. So join us next time for a thematically linked episode where we'll be talking with a new guest about theatrical superstition. Have a good one. Bye.
Conclusion.
And bow.